The air in the Special Collections archive tasted of time itself, a dry, papery essence that clung to my tongue. Each morning, I, Cole Jensen, entered this hushed sanctuary, a place where history slept in brittle pages and forgotten scripts. My life was a symphony of quiet precision, every movement calibrated, every document handled with the reverence due to the whispers of vanished centuries. I found solace in the absolute order of it all, the meticulous indexing, the systematic preservation of humanity's fragile memory. My determination was a constant, a steady flame against the encroaching dust of oblivion. Today, my focus was a recent acquisition, the meticulously rendered blueprints of a long-lost coastal city, believed to have sunk beneath the waves millennia ago. These weren't mere sketches, they were masterworks of ancient draftsmanship, ink on vellum, preserved miraculously. My task was to digitize and cross-reference them with existing fragments of text, to piece together the ghost of a civilization. I worked at my custom-built workstation, bathed in the soft, diffused light that filtered through the archival windows. The scanner hummed a low, comforting tune, a counterpoint to the rustle of vellum as I carefully turned each page. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch, moved with an almost surgical grace. The first 100 pages revealed nothing but expected grandeur, soaring temples, intricate aqueducts, a sprawling network of residential quarters. Each line, each angle, spoke of a profound understanding of engineering and aesthetics, a civilization at its zenith. Then, it appeared. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible tremor in the otherwise perfect logic of the design. A single structure, nestled deep within the city's heart, an edifice labeled simply the Observatory. Its initial schematic showed a complex arrangement of spiraling ramps and observation platforms, typical of ancient astronomical sites. But as I progressed to the detailed cross-sections, a peculiar sense of dislocation began to prick at the edges of my meticulous calm. My eyes traced a series of interior hallways, narrow passages designed for access to the upper levels. One particular hallway, depicted in plan view, seemed to twist in on itself, a serpentine path that, according to its own indicated dimensions, should have intersected with a larger central chamber. Yet, in the adjacent elevation drawing, that same hallway simply vanished. It didn't terminate, nor did it open into another space. It just ceased to be, its path abruptly cut off by an impossible solid wall, a wall that, by all rights, shouldn't have been there. A shiver, slight as a breath, ghosted over my skin. This was not a typical drafting error. I had seen plenty of those, misaligned symbols, forgotten labels, smudged lines. This was different. This was a spatial impossibility, a hallway that existed in two conflicting states simultaneously. I leaned closer, my breath held. The ink was clear, unblemished, the lines sharp. No sign of erasure or alteration. I retrieved my magnifying loupe, its cool metal pressing against my brow. Under its magnification, the anomaly only sharpened. The hallway, in the plan view, continued its graceful curve, a clearly defined route. Yet the elevation, perfectly aligned and scaled, showed an unbroken expanse of stone where the passage ought to have been. It was as if the architect had drawn two irreconcilable truths on the same page, a paradox captured in ink. My mind, a carefully organized library of facts and logic, bristled. This was an affront to order, a defiance of the very geometry I understood. I cross-referenced the blueprint with a textual fragment I had recently processed, a diary entry from an ancient architect involved in the city's construction. The Observatory. The text read, a marvel of perception, where paths diverge and converge without end, a true reflection of the celestial dance. At the time, I dismissed it as poetic flourish, a metaphor for complex internal routes. Now, it felt like a chillingly literal description. I felt a subtle tension bloom behind my eyes, a dull ache that grew with each re-examination. This wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate, but why? What purpose could such an architectural lie serve? My fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I scanned the next blueprint sheet. Here, the impossible geometry manifested again. A support column, clearly shown extending from the base to a higher floor in one view, was depicted in an adjacent isometric drawing as simply ending mid-air, supporting nothing, anchored to nothing but empty space. Its top simply dissolved into the parchment, a phantom limb of stone. My mouth felt dry. I closed my eyes, trying to clear the image, to rationalize it away. Perhaps a missing page? A mislabeled drawing? I checked the pagination, the archival codes. All perfectly sequential, perfectly matched. I needed air, a break from the suffocating implications of these drawings. Stepping outside the archive building, the biting winter wind offered a stark contrast to the stagnant air within. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of snow. My gaze drifted towards the distance, to the vast, flat expanse of the frozen lake that bordered the edge of the city. Its surface, a sheet of milky ice, stretched into the gray horizon, an unbroken, indifferent plain. The lake's surface, so seemingly solid, so unyielding, yet beneath it lay depths unimaginable, currents unseen, a world entirely alien to the one above. And these blueprints. They were like that. A surface of perfect order, but beneath, or perhaps within their very structure, lay something fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. My mind was still trapped in the impossible hallways, the vanishing columns. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved with logic. This was a fracture in logic itself, a tear in the fabric of what I understood to be real. The dry, papery essence of the Special Collections Archive, once a comforting perfume, now carried a faint, unsettling tang, like ozone before a storm. Yet, this anomaly, a structure that defied logical egress, a building whose internal geometry seemed to fold back on itself, was a dissonance I could not ignore. My fingers, usually so precise, trembled ever so slightly as I pulled another folio from its shelf. The first instance had been a medieval blueprint, tucked within a treatise on fortifications. Today, I began a methodical sweep, an archivist's response to an itch in the meticulous fabric of his world. I started with early modern civic plans, then moved to Renaissance sketches of cathedrals, then even further back, to Roman cadastral maps. It was a fool's errand, I told myself, a trick of light or a misinterpretation on my part. Hours blurred into a quiet hum of turning pages and the soft whisper of my own breath. My eyes, accustomed to deciphering faded ink, began to ache. Then, nestled within a collection of 18th-century colonial land surveys, I found it. Not a direct copy, but an echo. A central plaza, drawn with meticulous care, possessed an interior space that, by the laws of perspective, could not exist in the way it was depicted. It was a phantom quadrant, a spatial paradox rendered in confident pen strokes. A cold prickle traced its way down my spine. This wasn't a mistake. Not twice, not with such disparate origins. My gaze drifted from the parchment to the sturdy oak shelves that lined the archive, then to the high, arched windows. For a fleeting instant, The meticulously arranged spines of the books seemed to ripple, their labels blurring into indecipherable streaks of color. I blinked hard, the sensation vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. Just fatigue, I reasoned, rubbing my temples. Too many hours spent under the glow of the archival lamps. I cross-referenced the colonial survey with the medieval blueprint, searching for any commonality in their provenance, their creators. Nothing. They were separated by centuries, continents, and entirely different cultural contexts. Yet, the impossible geometry, the recursive spatial arrangements, shared an uncanny, unsettling signature. The air in the archive, once still and dry, seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. I felt a subtle vibration beneath my feet, a low thrumming that I initially dismissed as the building settling. But it persisted, a resonant frequency that seemed to bypass my ears and directly vibrate the bones in my skull. I pushed back my chair, its scrape unnaturally loud in the hushed expanse. I found myself walking without conscious thought, my feet carrying me through the city's hushed evening streets, the winter air biting and clean. My destination, though unchosen, was inevitable, the frozen lake. As I stepped onto the snow-dusted shore, the wind whipped around me, carrying the faint scent of pine and crisp water. I walked towards its center, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound. The ice groaned beneath me, a deep, resonant sigh that was familiar, yet today it sounded different. It wasn't the natural shift of a vast frozen body. It was deeper, a note held too long, too low, as if something immense stirred far beneath the surface, not within the water, but within the ice itself. Then, the world around me subtly warped. The distant lights of the city, usually pinpricks on the horizon, seemed to stretch and distort, their sharp edges blurring into elongated smears of color. The very surface of the frozen lake, so flat and solid moments before, appeared to curve inwards, as if I stood on the belly of a colossal, invisible bowl. My stomach lurched, a sickening vertigo that had nothing to do with balance and everything to do with perception. When I opened them, the city lights were sharp again, the lake's surface flat and unwavering. But the memory of the distortion, the brief, horrifying glimpse of a world that didn't adhere to its own rules, lingered. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't imagination. The impossible angles and the blueprints, the phantom quadrants and the surveys, they weren't errors. They were patterns. Signatures. A language, perhaps, or a structural truth that was slowly, inexorably, revealing itself to me. I had to know more. I had to understand. Even if understanding meant ceasing to be myself. The air in the archive, once merely still, now felt heavy, almost viscous, as if it resisted the very act of breathing. Driven by a desperate need to confirm, to share, to anchor myself to something tangible, I sought out a colleague, a fellow archivist who specialized in medieval cartography. I found her hunched over a folio of illuminated manuscripts, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've found something," I began, my voice raspy from disuse, the words spilling out in a torrent. "A blueprint, from the Kestrel collection. It depicts structures, spaces. They don't conform to any known geometry. They are impossible." She looked up, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose, her expression shifting from mild interest to something akin to polite concern. "Impossible, Cole? You mean, highly unconventional? Perhaps a conceptual design, not meant for physical construction?" Her tone was gentle, almost patronizing, as if addressing a child who had misplaced a toy. "No," I insisted, my hands gesturing wildly, trying to convey the sheer wrongness of it. Not unconventional. Non-Euclidean. Walls that curve into themselves yet remain straight, corridors that narrow infinitely yet lead to a wider space. It's as if the very rules of dimension are being broken on paper. She removed her spectacles, cleaning them with a slow, deliberate motion. Cole, you've been working on the Kestrel collection for months. It's dense, complex. It can be disorienting. Perhaps you're seeing patterns where there are none, or interpreting artistic license too literally. We all get a bit lost in the labyrinth sometimes. She offered a thin, sympathetic smile, a gesture that felt less like camaraderie and more like a gentle dismissal. The implied message was clear: I was overworking, imagining things. She believed I was unraveling, not that reality itself might be. The conversation, or lack thereof, left me colder than any draft. It wasn't just her disbelief, it was the way her eyes held a flicker of something new, something that wasn't respect for my scholarship, but rather a quiet, internal assessment of my sanity. My colleagues, once fellow travelers on the path of knowledge, now seemed distant, their understanding confined to a world that was, perhaps, no longer mine. I retreated, not to rest, but deeper into the stacks. The dismissive words fueled a new, dangerous determination. If they couldn't see it, I would prove it. I devoured ancient texts, forgotten treatises, obscure architectural sketches from every corner of the collection. I found more. Each discovery was a splinter in my mind, a tiny fissure in the bedrock of my understanding. Sleep became a luxury I could not afford, my days and nights blurring into a single, obsessive pursuit. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, a constant companion, a taste of something ancient and terrible. One frigid afternoon, the weight of the archive, the sheer density of its unspoken secrets, pressed down upon me with an unbearable force. My head throbbed, and the faint hum that had begun in my ears intensified, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The vast expanse of ice, glazed smooth by the wind, stretched out before me, reflecting the bruised, winter sky. I stood at the shore, breathing deeply, watching the distant, skeletal trees shiver in the wind. The ice was a canvas of muted white and gray, crisscrossed by natural fractures, delicate spiderwebs of crystalline imperfection. I focused on them, on their chaotic beauty, trying to find solace in their random, organic patterns. Then, it happened. A shift. Not in the light, not in my vision, but in the very fabric of the lake's surface. The fractures deepened, broadened, coalesced into something utterly alien. They became lines, impossibly straight, impossibly angled, forming vast, interlocking shapes that defied Euclidean geometry. A faint, impossible sound, like stone grinding against stone but without friction, echoed from beneath the ice, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. The impossible angles dissolved, the towering structures collapsed back into the familiar, natural fractures of the ice. The sounds ceased. The surface of the frozen lake was once again just that, a frozen lake, vast and indifferent. I stumbled back, gasping, the cold air searing my lungs. My mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation. Exhaustion? A hallucination brought on by lack of sleep? This was no fleeting illusion. This was real. This was a crack in the world, a direct, undeniable breach. I was no longer merely cataloging impossible architecture, I had witnessed it. The metallic tang in my mouth was no longer phantom, it was the taste of the truth, bitter and terrifying. The colleague's words, soft as a shroud, still echoed in the hollows of my skull. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. They mistook my clarity for delusion, my revelation for a fatigue-induced mirage. How could they understand the cold, mathematical impossibility I'd glimpsed within the Kestrel collection's ancient plans? How could they feel the subtle shift in the world's very grain? I left the hushed, sunlit office, the aroma of old paper and dust clinging to my clothes like a second skin. The archives, a sprawling labyrinth of forgotten knowledge, beckoned. I walked past the familiar rows of meticulously ordered shelves, my gaze no longer sweeping over titles but piercing through the mundane. There had to be more. The Kestrel collection was merely an entry point, a key left carelessly in a lock. My fingers, tingling with an unfamiliar prescience, traced the spines of volumes in a section dedicated to obscure regional folklore and forgotten building codes. It was an unlikely pairing, a custodial oversight that had always amused me. Now, it felt deliberate. I knelt, pushing aside a teetering stack of municipal ledgers from the early 1800s. Behind them, obscured by decades of dust and a false-fronted panel, was a narrow, unlit passage. It was less a door, more a seam in the wall, perfectly camouflaged. This was it. This was the hidden artery I hadn't known I was searching for. I fumbled for my small penlight. The passage was cramped, smelling of damp earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or ozone. My breath caught in my throat. The walls were not plaster or brick, but rough-hewn stone, crudely cut, as if hewn by hands that didn't quite understand human geometry. They curved inward, pressing against my shoulders as I squeezed through. Each step echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the dense air. The passage opened into a small, circular chamber. Here, the air was still, heavy, and strangely resonant, as if perpetually vibrating with a low, inaudible hum. The penlight beam danced across shelves carved directly into the stone, laden not with books, but with peculiar objects. There were scrolls of vellum, yellowed and brittle, covered not in script but in intricate, impossible diagrams. Lines converged at points that shouldn't exist, angles twisted into non-Euclidean forms, and structures seemed to fold back on themselves, defying dimension. It wasn't merely architecture, it was a blueprint for a different kind of reality. I reached for a small, heavy cube of obsidian, its surfaces polished to a mirror sheen. My vision blurred. The chamber walls seemed to ripple, the stone softening, flowing like liquid. For a fleeting instant, I saw not stone, but a complex weave of impossibly fine filaments, shimmering with an inner light, vast and indifferent. Structure. The weight of being. It was the sound of something immense and ancient thinking, constructing, undoing. I dropped the cube, gasping, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The chamber solidified around me once more, but the memory of the vision clung to my eyes, a persistent afterimage. My hands trembled as I picked up a thick, leather-bound tome. Its pages were not paper, but a material like dried, pressed sinew. The text was a language of symbols, glyphs that writhed and shifted before my eyes, hinting at a vastness that dwarfed human comprehension. This wasn't forgotten knowledge, this was forbidden knowledge, locked away for a reason. My head throbbed. The low hum in the chamber grew louder, resonating in my teeth, vibrating through the soles of my feet. It was a sound that seemed to precede all other sounds, the fundamental vibration of existence itself. They spoke of angles that held the fabric of the world together, of dimensions folded into oblivion, of a grand design that was both beautiful and utterly monstrous. I needed air. I needed to escape the suffocating weight of this revelation. I burst back into the main archive, gulping the familiar, if dusty, air. The normal rows of books seemed frail, insubstantial, their orderly spines a pathetic illusion. The sky was a bruised purple, streaked with the last vestiges of a dying sun. The world here was stark, stripped bare. The wind whipped at my coat, biting at my exposed skin. I stared at the ice, its surface smooth and opaque. But as I watched, a flicker. A distortion. They were the very forms I'd seen in the vellum scrolls, now manifested, impossibly, beneath the lake's fragile crust. The surface of the ice was no longer a mirror, but a window into something beyond. It is here. Always here. I knew, with a certainty that threatened to shatter my mind, that I had only just begun to see. And what I had seen was already seeing me back. The colleague's words, brittle as old parchment, still clawed at the walls of my mind. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. They saw confusion, I saw a dawning, terrible clarity. They mistook my certainty for delusion, yet it was their blindness that felt truly precarious. I returned to my archive, a sanctuary usually, now a crucible. The air, typically thick with the scent of aged paper and quiet contemplation, felt different. Thinner. Perhaps, or charged with an unspoken hum. My determination, a fragile lantern in the deepening gloom, pushed me forward. I needed to re-examine, to find the anchor points, to prove the impossible. My desk, a topography of stacks and open folios, seemed subtly altered. The heavy brass magnifying glass, usually nestled in its velvet-lined depression, lay slightly askew, its polished surface reflecting a sliver of the ceiling I didn't recall seeing before. A minor shift, a careless bump, I told myself, yet a prickle of unease traced its path along my spine. I reached for the blueprint I'd been scrutinizing, the one with the impossible spiral staircase descending into non-space. It wasn't there. My gaze swept the desk, then the surrounding shelves. My system was meticulous, almost ritualistic. Unfinished work remained on the desk, finished work was filed immediately. The blueprint, a large, rolled vellum sheet, should have been directly beneath the current folio. It wasn't. A cold tremor, quick and sharp, cut through my chest. I began to search, methodically at first, then with increasing urgency. I moved stacks of historical records, lifted leather-bound tomes, peered under the desk lamp. Nothing. The blueprint, the very artifact that had ignited this terrible quest, had simply vanished. Impossible, I whispered, the word tasting like ash. I stood, turning slowly, my eyes scanning the familiar shelves, each oak beam and recessed alcove a testament to years of ordered existence. Then I saw it. On the top shelf, nestled between two encyclopedic volumes on ancient cartography, was a rolled sheet of vellum. Not just any vellum, but that vellum. My blueprint. My breath hitched. I hadn't touched those cartography books in months. The shelf was high, requiring a step stool. I distinctly remembered placing the blueprint on my desk. My hand trembled as I retrieved the stool, my mind racing, trying to conjure a plausible explanation. Had I, in a moment of distraction, tidied up? Unlikely. My archival habits were ingrained, almost involuntary. As I climbed the stool, the oak floorboards beneath my feet groaned with a note of unfamiliar complaint. The room seemed to expand slightly, the ceiling stretching upwards, making the top shelf feel further away than it should have been. It was indeed the blueprint. I descended, my legs suddenly weak. The room, which had moments before felt vast, now seemed to press in, the walls subtly closer, the air thicker. I tried to walk to the window, needing the solid reassurance of the outside world, but the path felt wrong. The distance from my desk to the window, usually a mere 7 paces, stretched into 10, then 11. My strides, measured and deliberate, seemed to eat up less space than they should have. Each step was a plunge into a viscous current. I reached the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the familiar vista of the woods, skeletal in winter, lay bathed in the pale, watery light of what I judged to be late afternoon. But earlier, just before I'd returned, it had been mid-morning, the sun bright and sharp. Had I lost hours? Had I been so absorbed in my mental struggle that time had simply slipped through my grasp? A faint, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the room. The tall grandfather clock in the corner, a silent sentinel for decades, had rotated slightly on its base. Its ornate face, once angled towards the door, now faced directly at my desk, its brass pendulum swinging with an eerie, rhythmic hum that I had never noticed before. My mind reeled. This was a deliberate, insidious reordering. My home, my archive, the very space I inhabited, was no longer static. It was a shifting labyrinth, subtly, terrifyingly alive. I needed air. My hand reached for the door handle, cold metal against my palm. I pulled, and the door swung open, not into the hallway I expected, but into a narrow, unfamiliar passage. The walls were unpainted plaster, rough and uneven, unlike the smooth, papered walls of my house. This was not my home. Or it was, but warped, twisted into an impossible configuration. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and tried another door. It led to a closet I knew well, but the shelves inside were empty, stripped bare, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. I stumbled through my house, or what I thought was my house, each turn revealing a new impossibility. A room that had once been my study was now a blank, windowless chamber. A hallway ended abruptly in a solid wall where a door should have been. The layout was a lie, a fluid deception, and I was trapped within its unfolding nightmare. Desperate for solid ground, for something unchanging, I burst through what I hoped was the back door. I ran, blindly, through the familiar but somehow foreign landscape of my backyard. The trees seemed to lean in, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching. It lay before me, a vast, silvered expanse under the pale, indifferent sky. The ice, usually a smooth, unbroken mirror, was patterned with intricate, swirling fractals that seemed to writhe beneath the surface. They were too perfect, too complex, like the impossible geometries in the blueprints. I knelt, pressing my gloved hand against the ice. I stared into the milky depths, and for a terrifying moment, the patterns seemed to shift, to coalesce, forming shapes that were both familiar and utterly alien. The colleague's words faded, replaced by the silent scream in my own mind. There were patterns, yes. And they were disorienting. But they were not artistic license. They were real. And they were everywhere. Disorienting. patterns where there are none. They saw only ink on paper, lines and curves, the innocuous dance of geometry. I saw the tremor beneath the surface, the impossible angles that defied every known law of construction, the whispers of a world folded in upon itself. The vast, silent rows of shelves, the scent of aging paper and dust, the muted light filtering through high windows, all these familiar comforts now held a subtle menace. The geometries I'd unearthed were no longer confined to the brittle pages. My peripheral vision was a constant battlefield, glimpses of impossible structures forming and dissolving, the edges of my sight fraying like worn fabric. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams were a kaleidoscope of shifting spaces, corridors that spiraled into themselves, chambers with too many corners, too few. The line between waking and dreaming, between the solid world and the one I was uncovering, blurred into an indistinguishable smear. One frigid afternoon, the weight of it all became unbearable. The air in the archive felt too thick, too heavy with unseen presences. I needed clarity, the brutal honesty of open space, the kind that strips away illusion. The wind, sharp as shattered glass, whipped around me, tearing at my coat. The lake stretched out, a vast, polished mirror under a sky the color of bruised plums. The ice was a sheet of pale gray, scarred with deep fissures that spider-webbed across its surface, like ancient, forgotten glyphs. This was solid. This was real. Or so I desperately tried to convince myself. Then, it began. A shimmering, a distortion in the reflection of the clouds. But as I stared, the patterns on the ice began to shift, to coalesce. The fissures deepened, not just physically, but visually, forming contours that were too deliberate, too knowing. And then, I saw them. Faces. They bloomed from the gray depths, ephemeral and shimmering, like specters trapped just beneath the surface. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the shape of them was wrong, alien, as if her jaw had been unhinged. Next to her, another image bloomed, a childhood friend, a boy with bright, mischievous eyes I hadn't thought of in decades. His arm, impossibly long, reached out from the ice, his fingers tapering into needle-like points, beckoning. The images swirled, multiplying. Faces from old photographs, faces I barely remembered, faces I thought I had forgotten entirely. My grandfather, stern but kind, now wore an expression of unspeakable agony, his mouth a gaping maw. Each one was a familiar echo, a fragment of my past, but each was horribly defaced, their identities peeled back to reveal something raw and monstrous beneath. They weren't just distorted, they were wrong. They were caricatures of memory, grotesque parodies designed to undermine every foundation of my personal history. Had they always looked like this? Had my mind merely imposed a comforting lie over these hidden horrors? They was my entire past, every cherished memory, merely a construct, a fragile illusion maintained by my own perception? I stumbled backward, my boots skidding on the slick ice, my breath ragged in my chest. My past, my identity, everything I thought I knew about myself, was dissolving before my eyes, replaced by these impossible, haunting visages. The entity wasn't just reshaping reality, it was reaching directly into the most sacred chambers of my mind, twisting the very threads of my being. I ran. My memories, once anchors, were now weapons, wielded by an unseen hand, tearing at the fabric of Cole Jensen. I was unraveling. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. They saw only what their limited vision allowed. I, however, had begun to see beyond the veil. The frozen lake stretched before me, a vast, silvered mirror under the low, gray sky. A biting wind, sharp as shattered glass, whipped across its surface, stinging my exposed skin and stealing the warmth from my breath. I clutched the rolled-up blueprints, their edges stiff with cold, my fingers numb even through my gloves. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a brief, white ghost against the stark backdrop. I knelt, the ice-cold, unforgiving plane beneath my knees, and carefully unrolled the largest printout. It depicted a section of the impossible structure, a cross-section where lines converged at angles that defied the very laws of space, where corridors twisted back upon themselves without ever truly turning. It was a diagram of paradox, a silent scream etched in ink. My plan was simple, perhaps even desperate in its simplicity. If these geometries were truly impossible, they could not manifest in the natural world. By attempting to find them, to project them onto the ice, I would prove their unreality. Or, conversely, I would discover something far more terrifying. I began with a long, almost imperceptible fissure in the ice, a hairline fracture that stretched for meters. I laid the tape beside it, measuring its length, noting the subtle deviations. Then, I placed one of my cardboard angles against a junction where smaller cracks branched off. A 90-degree angle, I muttered to the wind, my voice thin and reedy. A perfect right angle, as it should be. But as I shifted my gaze from the blueprint to the ice, a tremor of unease began to ripple through my carefully constructed composure. The blueprint showed a junction, a point where three walls met, but the angles were all wrong, summing to something other than 360 degrees. It was a visual impossibility, a spatial lie. I placed my protractor against the ice, aligning it with one crack, then another. The first angle was 75 degrees. The second, 90. The third angle, the one that should have completed the circle, was 180 degrees. My hand shook, the protractor clattering softly against the ice. 75, 90, and 180. 255 degrees. Not 360. The numbers were wrong. They were horrifically, impossibly wrong. My initial thought was error, a slip of the hand, but I checked and rechecked, my eyes scanning the protractor's markings with a frantic intensity. The physical manifestation of the ice cracks insisted on these values. The sum defied geometry. I moved to another section, then another, my heart now a frantic drum against my ribs. I sought out any pattern, any natural formation in the ice that remotely resembled the blueprint's distortions. And I found them. Not exact replicas, not crude copies, but resonances. The intricate tessellations of frost on the surface, which I had once admired as nature's artistry, now seemed to twist and reform, presenting fleeting glimpses of impossible symmetries, structures that shifted and dissolved at the edge of my vision. But when I looked at it from a slightly different angle, the line seemed to subtly curve, to bow inward, only to snap back to linearity when I moved my head. The indifference of the vast, frozen lake no longer felt like a blank canvas, but an active participant, a silent, mocking witness. It wasn't just reflecting the sky, it was reflecting me, my failing sanity, and the horrifying truth that the universe itself might be constructed on principles my mind simply could not grasp. In the bending of light, the impossible angles of ice. Confirming them as the very bedrock of existence. The colleague's words returned, but this time, they held a new, terrible weight. Patterns where there are none. What if the patterns were there, all along, hidden in plain sight, and only now, through the lens of forbidden knowledge, Could I truly perceive their horrifying, indifferent truth? My hope, once a fragile ember, flickered, threatened by the vast, uncaring expanse of a reality that refused to conform to human reason. I was not disproving the impossible, I was discovering its omnipresence. And the knowledge was a poison, slowly, irrevocably, consuming my mind. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. Yet, as days bled into a monochrome haze, my defiance began to feel like a flimsy shield against an invisible siege. The world, once a symphony of distinct sensations, started to fray at the edges. A sharp, metallic taste would sometimes bloom on my tongue when the old furnace in the archive clanged to life, its roar painting the air a lurid, coppery red. The scent of aging paper, usually a comforting perfume, would occasionally trigger a phantom ache in my joints, a deep, bone-weary throb that had no source, no injury. It was as if my senses, once loyal sentinels, had turned traitor, exchanging their posts, whispering lies to my brain. I tried to ignore it, to attribute it to exhaustion, to the relentless strain of my research. I pored over the documents, my fingers tracing the impossible lines, the non-Euclidean structures that seemed to breathe a silent, alien logic. But the distortions only intensified. The rustle of a turning page became a dry rasp against my eardrums, feeling like sandpaper dragged across raw skin. One afternoon, standing before a towering shelf of ancient folios, a sudden, searing pain flared in my left forearm. It wasn't a muscle cramp or a bump against the shelf, it was a deep, burning pressure, as if a heavy, invisible hand had clamped down, squeezing bone against bone. I gasped, clutching the limb, but when I pulled back my sleeve, the skin was unmarked, pale and smooth. The sensation lingered, a phantom limb of agony, a memory of trauma I had never experienced. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks, it felt like my body itself was becoming a canvas for something else's torment. The archive, once my sanctuary, became a cage of escalating sensory chaos. The air thickened, tasting of static and old iron. I needed air, space, a place where the world felt vast and uncomplicated. My feet, guided by a desperate impulse, carried me away from the city's suffocating embrace, towards the stark, unyielding expanse I knew lay beyond. The air bit at my exposed skin, sharp and clean, yet even here, the betrayal followed. The wind, howling across the ice, didn't just sound like wind, it was a dissonant chord, a wail that tasted of salt and something metallic, like blood in my mouth. Each gust brushed against my skin not as cold air, but as 1,000 tiny, needle-sharp pricks, as if countless unseen insects were crawling over me, their phantom legs leaving trails of ice. I walked out onto the ice, each step a brittle crackle beneath my boots. My reflection, distorted by the subtle imperfections of the ice, stared back at me. My face seemed subtly elongated, my eyes too wide, too deep. Was it just the ice, or was I truly seeing a subtle shift in my own form? A wave of nausea, thick and viscous, rolled through me. It felt as though my very core was being kneaded, reshaped, my organs rearranging themselves with a silent, internal groaning. A deep, aching pressure began to build behind my sternum, not a heart attack, but a sensation of my ribcage slowly expanding, then contracting, as if breathing a different, more profound breath than my lungs could manage. It was a sound that didn't just register in my ears, it was a vibration that felt like it was playing my bones, my sinews. They were echoes. Repercussions. My senses were not just failing, they were becoming conduits, registering the slow, agonizing contortion of reality itself, a process that was now, irrevocably, beginning to reshape even me. The world was unraveling, and I, Cole Jensen, felt the threads pulling not just at my mind, but at the very substance of my flesh. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. They saw lines on paper. I saw the skeletal framework of a reality peeling back. The last anomaly, a fleeting shadow in the margin of an obscure 17th century cartography text, had become an anchor, a beacon. The coordinates led me north, then further north, past the last gas station, beyond the last flickering cell tower. The world thinned, shed its familiar skin. My hands, clammy on the wheel, steered me towards an inevitable confrontation. Each mile was a thread pulled from the tapestry of my former life, unraveling me, preparing me for the raw edge of truth. The air grew sharp, biting, carrying the metallic tang of impending ice. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a ghost of my dwindling sanity. The world outside the windshield flattened into a monochrome canvas of white and gray, the only variations the skeletal forms of winter-stripped birches. Then, the landscape opened, vast and stark. The ice groaned, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in my bones, a living, breathing thing beneath its crystalline skin. No tracks marred its pristine expanse, no signs of human passage, only the stark calligraphy of frost on the skeletal reeds at its edge. This was not merely a body of water suspended in winter, it was a threshold, a vast, unblinking eye staring back at the indifferent cosmos. And there, at its very center, where no island should have been, where no geological formation could possibly exist, stood the impossible structure. Its facets caught the faint, gray light, refracting it not into colors, but into absences, pockets of light that swallowed definition. Spire-like formations ascended not upwards, but inwards, converging on a point that seemed to exist outside of space itself. It hummed with a low, resonant frequency that bypassed my ears and settled directly into the marrow of my bones, a sound that was also a pressure, a thought, a memory that wasn't mine. It pulsed, subtly, like a slow, deliberate breath, and with each pulse, the very air around it shimmered, blurring the sharp edges of the world, making the distant trees waver like reflections in disturbed water. My mind screamed, a thin, reedy sound against the vast, silent roar of the impossible. Every instinct shrieked retreat, to flee this blasphemy against the ordered world, but a deeper, more primal current pulled me forward. The structure grew larger, more incomprehensible, with every step I took onto the frozen lake. I could feel its vast, silent indifference pressing in, trying to flatten me, to erase me. As I neared, the crystalline geometry of the structure began to shift, not physically, but perceptually. Angles folded into themselves, dissolving into curves that were simultaneously sharp and smooth, solid and ethereal. It was a visual paradox, a thing that existed in multiple states at once, like a concept too vast for the human mind to fully grasp. From its deepest recess, a tremor emanated, not of sound, but of pure, unadulterated presence. It was not a physical being, not a creature of flesh or stone, but a fragment, a sliver of an entity whose true form would surely annihilate all understanding. Within its depths, I saw not eyes, but insights, not a mouth, but utterances that unmade meaning. Shapes flickered within it, not of anything I knew, but of fundamental axioms twisted, realities unspun. My vision swam, not with dizziness, but with the sudden, terrifying understanding that my own existence was merely a fleeting shadow cast by something infinitely older, infinitely larger, utterly alien. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, a direct communion with the indifferent, elder entity, a partial manifestation that still threatened to shatter the very frame of my sanity. I was no longer Cole Jensen, archivist, but a momentary flicker on the threshold of something immense and terrible. The air crackled, not with electricity, but with the sheer weight of its impossible being. I stood, transfixed, my mind stretched taut, thin as spun glass, ready to splinter into a million shards of meaningless data. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. My conviction now burned with a singular, terrifying clarity. They saw a trick of light, a quirk of my own perception. I saw the shadow of a truth they were too comfortable to acknowledge, a truth that pulsed beneath the surface of every familiar thing. The wind howled a hollow, endless note as I prepared for the journey. This was not a place for idle curiosity, but a pilgrimage to the precipice. I carried only what was essential, a worn satchel containing my research notes, a compass, and a thermos of lukewarm tea. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance against the instinct that screamed for retreat, a measured advance into the heart of the unknown. Hours later, the tree line receded, giving way to an expanse of desolate, windswept white. I walked onto its surface, each crunch of my boots against the hoarfrost feeling sacrilegious. The ice was ancient, scarred by invisible currents, but now held still, a solid, unwavering plain. Or so it seemed. But it was not the depth that drew my gaze. It was the surface itself, a canvas of frozen water, stretching to the horizon. But then, the distortions began. They were subtle, insidious, not physical cracks or fissures, but imprints. Lines that curved with impossible grace, converging at points that defied Euclidean geometry. Angles that suggested a deeper, unseen framework. It was the language of my blueprints, made manifest not in ink, but in the very fabric of the world. My breath hitched. My mind, long accustomed to seeing these anomalies on parchment, now grappled with their undeniable presence in reality. The distant trees, their skeletal branches stark against the pale sky, seemed to subtly shift, their forms hinting at a series of nested, impossible shapes. The horizon line itself wavered, not with heat haze, but with an underlying structural instability, as if the world were a badly rendered projection. The patterns were not on the frozen lake, they were the frozen lake, the sky, the air itself. The world was a construct, and I was finally seeing its seams. The full horror unfurled then, not as a sudden revelation, but as an overwhelming, cumulative understanding. It was not a single image, but an omnipresent, indifferent lattice that permeated everything. The geometry of the air, the underlying structure of light, the very space between the flakes of snow clinging to my coat, all were governed by an intricate, alien logic. It was the grand design, vast and indifferent, the true blueprint of existence, stretched out before me on the immense, frozen canvas. It held no beauty, no malice, no purpose that a human mind could grasp. It simply was. My mind, once a meticulous archive, began to fracture. The categorization, the analysis, the frantic attempts to impose order on the chaos, all dissolved. My perception shattered into 1,000 shards, each reflecting a fragment of the impossible truth. The individual trees ceased to be trees, becoming nodes in a vast, unknowable network. My own hands, raised before my face, were merely a temporary, localized concentration of these patterns, a fleeting illusion of solidity. I was not looking at the design, I was dissolving into it. My thoughts, once linear and coherent, became a jumble of raw data, a cascade of sensory input without a central interpreter. The fragile illusion of reality had shattered, and I, along with it, was unmade, consumed by the incomprehensible truth of the grand design. Disorienting. Patterns where there are none. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I was chasing. The wind, a raw, indifferent sculptor, carved at my face as I stood upon the frozen lake. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost against the vast, pale expanse of ice that stretched to a horizon indistinguishable from the bruised winter sky. The air itself seemed thin here, scraped clean of familiar scents, tasting only of cold and an ancient, mineral stillness. My boots crunched on the glassy surface, each step a fragile declaration against the immense silence. I had followed the final, most outlandish blueprint, a sketch of lines and impossible angles that, when overlaid with local topographical maps, pointed to this precise, desolate heart of the wilderness. But it was more than just a reflection. Trapped within its depths, I saw faint, shimmering geometries, like veins of light, twisting and interweaving, echoing the very patterns that had driven me from my quiet study. They were not cracks, not natural formations, but structures of pure, ethereal light, pulsing with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. My heart, a trapped bird, beat against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the lake's profound stillness. Instead, a strange resonance hummed through me, a chord struck deep within my own awareness. The lake was not merely frozen water, it was a lens, a membrane, a colossal eye staring back. And in that moment, I understood the final, terrible implication of the blueprints. They were not plans for a building, not even for a city. They were the schematics of being, the hidden architecture of reality itself. My eyes, no longer seeing with ordinary vision, traced the luminous lines beneath the ice. They converged, spiraled, then flared into a single, central point directly beneath where I knelt. It wasn't a source of light, but an absence, a well of utter blackness that devoured the light around it, yet shimmered with an impossible, internal luminescence. It was a paradox made manifest. Not a crack, not a groan, but a subtle, almost imperceptible undulation, like the slow, deep breath of something impossibly vast. The frozen lake groaned now, a sound like 1,000 lamenting voices, echoing from its depths. It was the sound of a dream stretching, tearing at its edges. My mind, already a frayed tapestry, began to unravel further. The world around me blurred. The distant tree-line rippled, the sky above fractured into shards of impossible color. I was no longer on solid ground, but adrift in a sea of pure sensation. The light was not just light, it was the crushing weight of infinite understanding, too vast for a single consciousness to bear. It drew me in, not with force, but with an irresistible, terrifying clarity. I saw the patterns now, not just as lines, but as the very threads of existence, woven and rewoven by an indifferent hand. The architectural anomalies, the impossibly angled corridors, the non-Euclidean spaces in the forgotten texts, they were not errors. They were the glimpses of the true form, the primordial design that underpinned everything. The entity was not a thing to be found in a hidden chamber or a forgotten dimension. It was the dimension. It was the chamber. My existence, my memories, my very sense of self, they were all constructs, illusions maintained by this ancient, slumbering architect, and now, it stirred. I felt myself dissolving. Not into nothingness, but into everything. My skin tingled, then burned, then ceased to exist as a boundary. My thoughts, once my own, became echoes in a boundless consciousness. I saw the universe as a diagram, a blueprint of infinite complexity, and my life, my entire history, was but a single, infinitesimal stroke within its grand, indifferent design. The frozen lake, my final destination, became my dissolution. My body, or what remained of it, sank into the shifting geometries, no longer distinct from the shimmering lines. The world continued to ripple, a vast, cosmic breath. But beneath, the impossible geometries pulsed, a silent, internal fire. And it was always watching.